Indeed, it is for me a great pleasure to welcome our first speaker, Professor Richard Holton. Professor Holton has taught in several universities at Monash, ANU, Sheffield, Edinburgh, and MIT, and is currently Professor of Philosophy at the University of Cambridge and a Fellow of Peterhouse. His work is mainly devoted to moral psychology, ethics, philosophy of law, philosophy of language. And he has, of course, made outstanding contributions to the problem of free will. Among those, let me just mention his great book, Willing, Wanting, Waiting, Oxford University Press, 2009. So I'm really glad indeed to give him the floor now for his talk, whose title is Cause and Agency. So please, Richard.
Si je peux continuer avec quelques mots en français, je suis très content d'être ici. J'étais fonctionnaire étranger à Nancy il y a 30 ans. Et les salles ont changé un peu, mais c'est bon d'être à Paris. Okay, I'm going to talk about cause and agency. I mean this talk to be a very general one. So part of my aim here is to introduce people to a number of the themes that I think are going to be coming up over the course of these 2 days. But I do have some views in this area, so I'm going to be putting those forward as well. And I'll try and talk for a short enough period to give us some time for questions at the end. Okay, so I've long been interested in why we have an experience of free will. So you mentioned in the introduction that not only do we have a theoretical view about the existence of free will, but there is something... Oh, I have to talk into the microphone because I won't be recorded otherwise, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Do I have to start again? Or well, I assume that we got enough of that. It wasn't really important for anyone tuning in from the web. Not only do we have theoretical conviction that we have free will, we also have something like an immediate experience of free will. And it's always struck me as slightly mysterious on a lot of the philosophical accounts how we could have that. So if you think of free will as a very recondite philosophical position to do with the idea that what you're causing is in some way uncaused further down, it seems rather surprising that you could have an experience of that. So for a while I've been interested in what it is that people do experience when they are experiencing free will and how that then should be turned into a philosophical account, or what kind of constraints that puts on a philosophical account. And I've done a little bit of work with some psychologists on this. One of these nice cases where you're thinking something and you talk to some psychologists and it turns out they're thinking the same sorts of things, and then they actually go and do some experiments on the things you were thinking might be right. And this is a very pleasing time when this happens. But so with Alison Gopnik and Tamir Kushnir, there's this idea that very young children, it turns out children around the age of 4, if you ask them about why they act as they do, they will tell you that they simply have a desire, and that desire just pushes them to act in a certain way. That is, they think of themselves as being slaves of their own passions in a very straightforward way. Right? They have a desire, the desire pushes them to do something. If you ask children around the age of 6, you get a rather different response, though. So by the age of 6, most children, and there's some recent studies that Kushnir and Gopnik have been doing, suggest that there's some cultural variation on this, but around the age of 6, children start saying that they have a desire, but that desire isn't going to push them to act. That is, they can deliberate, they can decide, they can use their will, as we might say in a rather more theoretically loaded fashion, to control the desires that they have. And my suspicion is that that experience, that is the experience of having desires to do things, of being moved to do them, but of then inhibiting those desires, is crucial to our understanding of our own self-control, of course, but also, I suspect, is important in understanding the experience of freedom that we have. Because we think of ourselves as being, in effect, free from determination by those psychological states. That is, you can have the psychological states, that is, the desires, beliefs, perhaps some prior intentions, but you don't think of those as sufficient to ordain a certain course of action. You think that you can intervene between having those psychological states and the action in order to either make the action in conformity with the desire or maybe make it go against the desire. And when you ask children around the age of 6 and then thereon, you find that as a very marked experience, and it particularly comes up in cases of temptation, of course, but also in moral cases. Some of those moral cases maybe we would describe as temptation, where you want to do something but you realize that's not the thing you ought to be doing. So you inhibit the desire you have in order to act in a way which conforms to how you think you ought to be acting, rather than how you would independently want to be acting. Okay, thinking about it that way then, we have a very simple and straightforward way of cashing out the experience of the ability to do otherwise. That is, you can think of the ability to do otherwise relative to the psychological states that the agent was in. So you can think, relative to those psychological states, you're not determined in what you're doing. That's the experience which people have. Now, interestingly, there's a further question, which is whether you are determined to do what you do relative not to your gross psychological states, but relative to the minute neurophysiological condition that you find yourself in. Right. Now, if we buy determinism at the neurophysiological level, of course, this is actually an open question because it raises all kinds of questions as to how that interacts with potentially non-deterministic causation at the micro level, at the quantum mechanical level. But putting that aside, let's assume that the neurophysiological is broadly deterministic issue. Then the question comes up, could you be determined at the micro level, that is, your brain is determined to act in certain ways, but not determined, be free at the psychological level? Okay, this issue is an issue which I think will come up in many of the papers over the next couple of days. That is, the potential autonomy or independence of the higher psychological level from the lower micro level. And it particularly comes up if you think that the higher level in some way supervenes or is dependent upon the lower level. That is, if you think that fixing the lower level will fix the higher level. If you think that, then there's a very natural way of thinking, which is that if the bottom layer is determined and it fixes the higher level, then the higher level must be determined too. Okay. I want to argue that that's a mistake. That actually doesn't follow. So that's going to be the main position I want to argue for. But as I say, a lot of what I would like to do is just get some of those ideas out into the open, because many of the other speakers have different views on this to mine, and I would just like everybody to be clear as possible on what some of these issues are. All right, so a little bit of background here. Let's first look at the linguistics of this. Let's look at the linguistics of could statements, statements about possibility, could and can. So the standard view in linguistics, following the work of Angelika Kratzer, is that these should be understood basically using a sentential modifier, that is, a modifier on the whole sentence. Now, let me just give a little bit of background, because this is not a theory which was formed in order to talk about the free will problem, right? So it's not an ad hoc response to the free will problem. This is a very general issue about the semantics of statements that involve claims about could and can. Okay, so think about a very ordinary statement, can I get back to London by noon? Well, it's now 9:45, right? Getting back to London by noon would certainly be very hard. And in fact, on an ordinary way of saying it, you might say, no, I couldn't get back to London by noon. Eurostar takes over 2 hours. By the time I'd got to the Gare du Nord and got on the train, there's no way I would get back to London. Okay, but of course, that could statement, if we got the Air Force to come and help, and I don't know, if you've got a cell phone, maybe you could get onto someone, if you were prepared to pay enough money, who could get us a helicopter somewhere in central Paris. We could probably get me back to London by noon if it was really important. So relative to other sets of considerations, the could statement looks to be true. And certainly if this was a physics class and we were talking about limits on absolute velocity, well, the limit on my absolute velocity back to London is the speed of light, and there's no problem getting back to London if I'm going anywhere near the speed of light, right, within 2.25 hours. So it looks as though the answer to the question, could I get back to London by noon, is going to be different relative to the sets of considerations which you think are relevant. Right. Well, so how do you cope with that? There's a relativity in the sense of could. Kratz's suggestion is that you shouldn't think of could as multiply ambiguous, because otherwise you're just going to have so many different senses of could, right? It's how would children learn it? It seems very implausible. What's much more plausible is that could is an indexical. That is, like other indexical statements, like here, now, whatever, it's something which changes its semantics, or at least it changes its interpretation, relative to some other parameter. And for her, the other parameter is a set of considerations relative to which you interpret the could. So very roughly, you think, hold these things fixed. Relative to these things, is this thing possible? That's her way of thinking about it. Okay, and that's just there in the context. So it's not explicitly articulated. You don't have to say what the considerations are, but the context tends to enforce a set of considerations as being the relevant ones. Right? So if we were in a physics class and someone said, could we move a body of my mass back to London within 2.25 hours? The answer is yes, very easily. If you were seriously asking me, couldn't you get back to London because you need to see someone at noon? The answer is no. Context has determined what the relevant considerations are. Okay, well, if that's clear, and that's the standard view in semantics. You ask any linguist for the semantics for could statements, the majority of them will certainly give you a story along those lines. But if that's right, then it's fairly straightforward to see why you might think that the could statement relative to psychological states is true, whereas the could statement relative to the neurophysiological basis of that is going to be false. Well, that's neat, right? So considerations that are not from the free will literature give you a nice way of understanding a very natural interpretation of why the question of determinism at the neurophysiological level doesn't tell you everything that needs to be said at the psychological level. But of course, as a philosopher, you might think that this has left things in a rather unsatisfactory position, right? You might think, well, look, this is an explanation for why people say these kinds of things. But what we want to know is it strictly and literally true that someone could behave otherwise than the way their desires are pushing them to behave? Two things to say about this. Firstly, it doesn't work, I think, just to sort of bang the table and say, look, you can give me this relativistic notion of could. I want to know whether someone really and truly could. Right? It doesn't work because the semantics of could just don't give you that absolute sense. They give you a sense relative to different considerations, and if you think the absolute considerations are the neurophysiological ones, then to that extent, relative to those, it's absolute. But that doesn't undermine the fact that this other sense is still available. Right? It's like someone banging their fist on the table and saying, look, I want to know what the time on the moon is. Right? Is it 5 o'clock or not on the moon or on the sun or wherever? Well, that sentence just doesn't make sense. Likewise, if someone says, look, I want to know what the time is on the world, on the earth. Well, there's no answer to what the time is on the earth because it depends on the time zone that you're in. So to that extent, I think you should just resist the demand for, well, what's the absolute truth about this? But of course, there's a deeper question, which is how you fit this semantics into a metaphysical picture, which can make sense of it. So what I want to do in the remainder is to say something a little bit about that. And the big problem here is a problem which I think many people will be addressing, which is a problem which Jakwon Kim articulated very nicely some years ago, which typically goes under the label of the exclusion problem. And the basic idea there is that if you have causation at the micro level, I would draw this on the board, but I've only got a tiny bit of board, and probably you wouldn't see it, so I'll have to do it using hand movements, and you'll have to interpret those as though I were leaving a line.
Sorry about that.
This is all this new technology.
Yes.
Like I say, 30 years ago it would have been easy to write on the board. So Kim's argument is, if you have determinism at the micro level, and if the psychological level is supervenient on that, then there's no place for independent causation at the psychological level, because in effect the causation at the micro level has crowded that out. There's no space for it. That's the exclusion problem. So if you think about the psychological level, you can't say, well, look, these psychological states, together with a certain act of will by the agent, are what caused them to do the thing that they did, if you think that that has also been caused at the neurophysiological level. In effect, the micro level crowds out the possibility of causation at the psychological level. If you think that argument is good, then there's a problem for the picture I was painting, right? Because you can accept that the statement at the higher level is true, namely, I could have done otherwise relative to these considerations, these psychological considerations. But the price of thinking that is that you have to think that the psychological considerations, the beliefs and desires, and the act of will, where you now decide which way you're going to go, are not themselves causally efficacious. And that seems like a very high price to pay, right? This then just becomes some kind of interpretive thing we say, but it's not something that actually hits the causal reality of what's going on. Okay, so let me start to say something about that. And of course, this is now going to depend very much upon the account of causation that one has. Account of causation, literature on causation is enormous, and it grows, maybe not quite exponentially, but it grows very large, by a very large degree every year. If people want to see something like the state of the art, I recommend the Paul and Hall book Causation, which gives a very nice summary of what's been happening over the last 20 years or so. I'm not going to get into all the details of that, because the details are way too complex, would take a very, very long time. But let me instead take a very crude characterization of causation, which is common, I think, to an awful lot of cases, It's not going to be the final word. I actually doubt that there's any final word on causation that can be given, because I doubt very much that causation is a topic which is amenable to reductive analysis. I mean, I think one thing that philosophy has found over the last 50 years or so is that all our attempts to do a reductive analysis on concepts have been a dismal failure. I mean, when you apply for research grants in philosophy, it's really embarrassing. If you look at the success of philosophy in analysing concepts over the last 50 years or so, that there really isn't a single case that you can point to as a successful analysis of a substantial concept. So I doubt that we could ever do that for causation. But to think that you can't give a completely adequate reductive analysis doesn't mean to say there aren't useful things that you can say about it. So let's take a very obvious way of thinking about it, based on David Lewis's initial account of causation. And let's just think in terms of a pair of counterfactuals, which I've put on the bottom of the handout here. So the first one, if the cause were to happen, the effect would happen. And the second, if the cause were to fail to happen, the effect would not happen. Anyone who's done any philosophy of causation will recognize these as the causal dependence relation that Lewis gives, not actually his account of causation even in the early papers, because he thought it was the ancestral of this relation. But we needn't go down the highways and byways. Let's just spend a little bit of time thinking about these two counterfactuals, though. I think that they are excellent rules of thumb. That is, when we're trying to assess whether causation occurs in a certain place, what we first look to are counterfactuals along these lines. I suspect they're often defeasible. That is, you can argue that causation happens even though both of these don't obtain. But if you argue that, you typically need to say something about why that's the case. Right? You need to say something about why this is a case of overdetermination or preemption or whatever that explains why. But rather than thinking about those problems, let's just think a little bit about what these things do. So the first counterfactual that you've got here, if the cause were to happen, the effect would happen, is basically an articulation of the sufficiency idea that's there in causation, right? The idea that the cause is enough to bring about the effect. And the second one is basically an articulation of the necessity condition. That is, if the cause didn't happen, the effect wouldn't happen. Now, the sufficiency condition, the first one, is the idea that underlies a great family of accounts of causation, namely the regularity accounts stemming from Hume and from other people. Of course, Hume, because he didn't believe in modality, wouldn't have phrased it like number one. And because he didn't believe in modality, he couldn't do the quantification over possibilities, which would be the standard way of thinking about the semantics of one. So instead, he had to do quantification over actual happenings. But he's still trying to get at the same idea, right? You're trying with those sufficiency accounts, which are articulated in very different ways since the early regularity theorists. So Mackey would be a good proponent, a good example of this. Mackey actually needs some counterfactuals in his account to make the thing work. They're still trying for something like the first one. The second one is the condition which the counterfactual theories tend to focus on. That's the necessity account. Why do the counterfactual theories tend to focus on the second one? Well, because for Lewis and Stolnacker, given their semantics for counterfactuals, the first condition is trivial if the cause and the effect have both actually happened. Right. Why is it trivial? Well, it's trivial because in the semantics for counterfactuals that Lewis and Stolnacker give, they adopt a principle known as strong centering, which says basically a counterfactual is true, just in case, in the closest possible world in which the antecedent is true, the consequent is true. Well, if the actual world is a world in which the antecedent is true, and is a world in which the consequent is true, the actual world must be the closest, that is, the most similar world, to itself. Therefore, trivially, the first condition will be true, just in case both antecedent and consequent are instantiated. That drops out of that definition of counterfactuals, but it's not obvious that it's right. It's not obvious that it's right for the semantics of counterfactuals, and it's certainly not obvious that it's right for the kind of condition that you want for the first clause of any kind of sufficiency account. First, let's just think about the counterfactuals, right? Suppose we don't know whether or not the antecedent has happened, right? And I say, look, if the antecedent were to happen, the consequent would happen. Well, if you wanted to buy that, it's not obvious that you'd be happy with the thought that it's just in the actual world that the antecedent happens and the consequent happens. You might want to think that for the counterfactual to be true, there's a certain robustness. That is, it's not just that the world actually instantiates that, but the worlds that are very similar to the actual world, still instantiating the antecedent, would also be instantiating the consequent. That is, it looks like you might, it's contentious, but you might want to move out from thinking that strong centering is true, that is, the actuality of it is enough to make counterfactual 1 true, to thinking that it requires a certain robustness, that is, in similar sorts of worlds, the antecedent, where the antecedent is true, the consequent is still going to be true. Okay. Well, now let's think a little bit about applying that to the case of causation. And I want to think about this by thinking about an example which Steve Yablo gives when he is talking about the exclusion problem. And I want to generalize a little bit some of the things that Yablo says there. So Yablo says, look, when we're thinking about causation, what we want is to have the right degree of fineness of definition in the antecedent and consequent to fit into the kind of causal relation that we want. That sounds rather abstract. Let me give you an example to bring it out. Suppose you have trained a pigeon to peck at red circles. This is Yablo's example. Whenever it sees a red circle, it pecks at it. That's because you've rewarded it in the past. If it sees a blue circle or a green circle, it doesn't peck at it. Maybe that's because you haven't rewarded it in the past. Maybe that's because you've punished it when it's pecked at anything other than a red circle. Okay. You now present it with a red circle. In fact, it's not just a red circle. It is a, what have I put on here? Scarlet, maybe, or vermilion, or take some shade of red, which is more specific than just red. It's a particular shade of red. If we were in England, I could say, postbox red, and that would pick out the particular kind of red which everyone has in mind when they think of that. So this circle is postbox red. Is it true that it's the postbox redness of the circle which causes the pigeon to peck at it? Yablo says, no, that's to make it too specific, right? It's not the postbox redness, it's the redness. It would still work even if the redness were of a different kind of redness. So that the fineness of discrimination that you want on that predicate should be one that matches the training that the pigeon has had. Okay, now let's think about an example slightly different to that, which is kind of the flip side of Yablo's example. Suppose, in fact, I have trained the pigeon up to peck only at postbox red things. Right? So you give it a vermilion thing, and you give it a shock if it pecks at it. Right? Pigeons are very good at, pretty good at colour discrimination, surprisingly good at colour discrimination. So it learns only to pick at postbox red circles. I present it with a postbox red circle, it pecks at it. Do I now want to say it was the cause of it pecking was that the circle was red? Well, that doesn't seem right, because it's not the redness, it's the postbox redness that caused it to do it. But if you look back at the two counterfactuals, if you interpret the first one in the Lewis-Stallnacher way, are going to come out as true. Right? You don't want the first one to come out as true. You want it to come out as false when you instantiate with just red. How do you get that? Well, you get it coming out as false by saying that the worlds which are close to this one, where it's still red but it's not postbox red, are not worlds where the pigeon pecks at it. Okay. So I think that once you're thinking about causation, whatever you say about counterfactuals, once you're thinking about causation, you certainly want, if you've got these necessary and sufficient conditions spelt out in the way they're spelt out by 1 and 2, you want 1 to be understood without strong centering. Once you do that, of course, you've got a substantial condition there in 1. It's not trivially met once antecedent and consequent are realized in the actual world. Okay, so, and then, of course, we've got something which makes the Humeans a bit happier, because there's a genuine sufficiency requirement that's come in, but it's a genuine sufficiency requirement which is now phrased in counterfactual style terms. That is, in the kind of way that people like Lewis and Stallnacher and the other counterfactual people have taught. As I say, if you were trying to make this into a reductive account, you would certainly have to qualify these. Have a look at Paul and Hall if you want to think about ways to qualify them. It gets extremely complicated. Probably within a counterfactualist framework, what you've got to do is to hold certain parameters fixed, and the ways of doing that become very complicated very quickly. Yablo has some very nice suggestions here, which may or may not work. But let's get back to our main theme, to the main theme of whether we can get independent causal claims at different levels. The advantage of thinking of it this way is that those independent causal claims can now be true. Right? So, going back to our pigeon, right? Our pigeon pecks at the circle because of certain neurological features in its brain. Okay. Well, the neurology there, when you start thinking about changing the neurology in small ways, who knows quite what conditions you get to with small changes of the pigeon's neurology. Right? They may not be changes which pick up the kinds of changes you get to when you think about changes in its psychological states. Why is that? Well, because there isn't a 1-1 correlation unless you buy a very strong reductionist, something like an identity theory, claim between neurological and psychological states. Right? That is, it could be that very small changes in the neurology give rise to very large changes in the psychology. So what you need to be thinking of changing at the neurological level when you're thinking about small changes is very different to what you need to be thinking about the psychological level when you're thinking about small changes there. That means then the truth conditions for the causal claim at the psychological level are going to be very different to the truth conditions for the causal claim at the neurological level. One little thing, let me just add a little caveat here, because it's easy when you're thinking about these changes and thinking about those in terms of possible worlds to think that what this is giving is a sort of non-localist account of causation. That is, you're thinking what makes this a cause is dependent upon things that happen elsewhere, namely in other possible worlds. Some people understand possible worlds in a way that would make that true. I think that's not the right way to think about them. I think the talk about possible worlds is just a rather colourful way of talking about the modal properties that the thing intrinsically and actually has. Well, maybe not intrinsically, but certainly actually has. So I don't think you're talking about things elsewhere. So you can think of this causation as a very localist notion, but it's a localist notion that is dependent upon the modal properties that the thing has, rather than just the actual properties that the thing has. That's a little caveat, partly for Tim, but not a mistake he would make, but you may be confused by the talk, so we just obviate any particular worries there. Okay, if you want to have a look at some recent work which cashes out this way of thinking, there's a very nice couple of papers by Christian List and Peter Menzies. List and Menzies have a nice one on the causal stuff, and List on his own has a nice application of this to the free will stuff, which I recommend. And they say things which are rather similar to the things that I've been saying, although motivated by slightly different concerns to mine with this particular psychological literature. Okay, let me finish by just talking about a worry, though, which is a worry you might have about this general idea of strengthening the first condition by removing strong centering. There's a little linguistic problem there, right? It's called strong centering, so you would think that taking it away would make for a weaker condition. Actually, taking away strong centering makes for a stronger condition, in the sense that it's a condition it's harder to meet, because it's no longer true that you meet the counterfactual just by actually instantiating. Okay, here's the case. Suppose that P is playing Russian roulette with B. That is, they're playing this game where you put one bullet into a 6-chambered revolver, you spin the chamber, and you point it at the victim's head, and you pull the trigger. Suppose P, the plaintiff, does this, pulls the trigger, and bad luck, the gun goes off, and P shoots V. Now, you might think, this clearly is a case where P has caused V to be shot. What could be a clearer case? And if you look for the moral responsibility of it, which you might think would follow that causal claim, of course the moral responsibility would follow. And yet you might think, look, given the strengthening of condition 1, we no longer have an account which endorses the claim that by playing Russian roulette, P had caused V to be shot. Why not? Well, because there are very close possible worlds in which the empty chamber was the one that landed by the hammer and not the chamber with the bullet in it. Therefore, the robustness condition built in now to the revised condition 1 is not met. That doesn't seem like a good outcome, right? I mean, Intuitively, it feels like P certainly caused V to be shot. And if you took it to any court of law, I'd love to see someone trying to run a defense which involved bringing Christian List in to explain his views on counterfactuals and then saying, therefore, the person didn't cause the death, therefore they should be exonerated from the murder charge or whatever it was. It wouldn't wash. But do we need to say that? Actually, we don't need to say that, because it would be fine if you said that there was one causal description here, which is false, provided you get a causal claim which is true. Right. So that is, you need a causal claim which does make it the case that P has caused V to be shot. But then if you are assuming a deterministic environment, you just need to add some more stuff into the antecedent, right? You need to say that P spun the chamber with a certain amount of force, which is such that that was sufficient to guarantee, in a way which brings one true, that the bullet would have ended up in the firing chamber. And it doesn't matter that there's another way of describing it, namely a less fine-grained way, where it comes out as false. And in fact, intuitively, you might like that, right? You might think, yeah, it's not just the playing Russian roulette that caused it, because he could easily have been playing Russian roulette and it wouldn't have happened. It was playing Russian roulette in such a way that it ended up in the firing chamber. And of course, once you're thinking about moral responsibility, that's strong enough. Okay. The cases this doesn't cope with are cases of genuine indeterminacy. Right? That is, if it's not Russian roulette you're playing, what you're playing is killing Schrödinger's cat, and Schrödinger's cat is going to be killed by something which is genuinely indeterministic, then there's no greater specification of the antecedent that you can give that will fix that. But maybe that's right. Maybe that's the right thing to say. I mean, who knows quite what to say about indeterministic causation? No, the accounts of indeterministic causation are not as well articulated as those for deterministic causation. But intuitively, it's not clear what you should say under those circumstances. I mean, if you put the cat into Schrödinger's box, I assume everybody knows the Schrödinger cat idea. You put the cat into this box with this thing controlled by the breakdown of some cesium atom or whatever it's meant to be, and it gases the cat if the atom decays within the time period, and it doesn't gas the cat otherwise. Maybe what you've actually done is put the cat in a very risky position. That's what you've caused. It's not obvious that you've actually caused the cat to be gassed, because that's in the hands of the cesium atom and not in your hands. Anyway, I will leave you with that to think about and stop there for questions.